Welcome to Trine Days The Journey, conversations with publisher Kris Millegan. I am Bruce Tatoris. With us are Richard Grove, a conceptual artist and forensic historian who teaches many things, including the ethics of freedom and how to think. He also provides entrepreneur, executive, and employee training through his University of Reason and its flagship course, AUTONOMY. His podcast can be found at grandtheftworld.com. Also with us is John O'Dowd, a retired scientist who worked in research, taught in universities, and worked for the UK government and several universities as a research manager. He discovered how government and academia have been captured and subverted by the money power, which controls academic research, paradigms, and teaching content, particularly in economics, political science and history, and increasingly, natural sciences and medicine. And now, our host, Kris Millegan.
Thank you, Bruce, very much. And thank you, Richard and John, for coming on with us. You know, the world's an interesting place, and history, uh, well, some people say it's, the story of the victors, but there's many threads to history. And I remember growing up, I just loved history, and I loved books, and I would read books and read books, and after I got out of school and just started roaming through libraries, I was amazed at some of the stuff that I found out in some of these books that they didn't teach me in school. Even in some deep history classes, I thought they would. I started trying day about 20 some years ago to look into this alternative history that, my daddy told me many years ago that it took me 20 years to understand what my daddy told me. And then I, started trying day to look into it more. He told me about the secret societies and the drug trade. And I was looking at one aspect of it, and then I came across the book Tragedy and Hope, okay, which Richard knows about. I mean, he named his website after that book because Mr. Quigley was quite an interesting man. And then one of his books, Anglo-American, it wasn't printed until after he died because that's what he requested. So, I mean, and this guy was a major professor at Georgetown University. He was even mentioned by Clinton in his inaugural address. And one thing that I found out because I was looking at CIA drugs and the drug trade and other things was that Clintons were basically lieutenants in the Bush crime family. Okay, and the crimes and the lies and the quote unquote conspiracy that has been done, is just mind boggling. Okay. And I've done a book before of Jim Macgregor's Prolonging the Agony. And I've got this new book coming out. Okay. It's probably going to be out in March or April. And it's called Two World Wars and Hitler. Who was responsible? Okay. And it is a tour de force. Jim came out with a book called Hidden History, The Secret Origins of the First World War, okay, from Mainstream Publishing out of Scotland, okay, who was basically owned by Random House, okay. And then him and his co-author in that one, Jerry Doherty, came up with another book, Prolonging the Agony, and brought it back to Mainstream and Random House, and they wouldn't print it.
Oh, they wouldn't print it.
Yeah. So Jim came to me and I said, yes, let's do this. It's Prolonging the Agony, how the Anglo-American establishment deliberately extended World War I by 3.5 years. Okay. And the documentation in that book is just very, very solid. And their title of their book, their premise is absolutely correct. And so Jim's been working on this.
Two World Wars and Hitler, Who was responsible? Anglo American money, foreign agents, and geopolitics.
And sadly, Jerry died, and he brought in John as a co-author. The material is sometimes you read it and you don't want to believe it. Okay, so I understand why Jim brings in a co-author because there's just so much material. You got to at least bounce it off one person to help you understand it. This book, if it really gets a good shrift, could change history. I don't know, but I want to start off, Richard. How did you discover tragedy and hope? And why should we listen to Mr. Quigley?
I discovered the book Tragedy and Hope in the year 2004. So it's a textbook for history written in 1966 by Carol Quigley, who was the Edmund A. Walsh Professor of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Carol Quigley, the professor, was trained by a Rhodes Scholar called Crane Brinton, and then Quigley trained Rhodes Scholar Bill Clinton. So there's a whole lineage of Rhodes Scholar influence in America, and people don't know what that means yet. So let's get into Tragedy and Hope, the book. I hear about this book in 2004, and it's an amazing story. And I actually, I got the 1,300 page book because I was incredulous. I did not believe the story that I was being told. And so I was researching alternative topics outside of the narrative. And I came across a video made by the Prophecy Club, which was a forum for, alternative truth stories during the 80s and 90s, and they would videotape it and then they would distribute it. So I'm watching this bootleg from eBay that I bought of conspiracy stuff, and it's Dr. Stanley Monteith. He was a dentist out of, San Francisco area, and he had put on a presentation called The Brotherhood of Darkness. And I was like, what's this all about? Is this the people that run the world? Where am I going to find the information on they, them, those? And so I'm watching this presentation. He's going all into the British culture, and like the first 20 minutes are lost on me. He's talking about like some poetry and, some stuff from British history. I'm not schooled on that. I'm American, and I got the official indoctrination system, so I don't know what's going on. And then he starts talking about this guy, Cecil Rhodes, and I didn't know who he was either. But he talked about De Beers. I was like, I've heard of De Beers. I don't know what that is. And I found out later it was a cartel that was not allowed to operate in America until like 10 years ago. It was an international cartel. So Cecil Rhodes is a British citizen, and he goes to South Africa following his brother, and his brother was like chasing gold mines and stuff like that. So Cecil shows up, and his brother's like, I'm off to this other new spot. You take over this spot. So he starts doing his thing. He starts seeing opportunity. He goes back to Britain. He goes to Oxford to, feel more official in what he's going to go down there and do. And then he gets funded by Lord Rothschild, and he goes back to South Africa. And when they have floods in the mines, they need pumps. So Rhodes goes around, he buys up all the pumps. So when the mines flood, he doesn't rent the pumps. They all have to sell their mines because it's worthless now. Then he uses his pumps and pumps out all those mines and takes over the farmer De Beers's diamond fields. So now he's down there and he's making a lot of good money. He's setting up a colony for the British Empire. He's a Freemason. He's friends with Rudyard Kipling. So he's got an agenda and a last will and testament that he wrote while he was at Oxford. He hears this British academic called John Ruskin, and Ruskin elucidates this dream of the British Empire taking over the whole world. Cecil Rhodes says that's a pretty good idea. So Rhodes makes his whole life about bringing the British Empire to world dominance, and they find one critical flaw in the plan. They don't have all the pieces they need to do that. What they need to do is get America back into the British Empire, which would be a very hard thing to do after 1776, but they set about creating a plan for that. So with America back in their empire, they could take over the world. So Rhodes's last will and testament, when he died in 1902, details Rhodes scholarships from Oxford. So 1,000-year-old British university has this plan, and they will take students from all over the world and school them in this, English-speaking dominance idea. And then there's also part of his will goes to a secret society. Now, how do I know this? That sounds conspiratorial. Well, it's in his will and testament. He says a society, a secret one, shall do this. So he specifies it. He has a co-conspirator called William T. Stead, who's a very famous British journalist. He wrote Review of Reviews. He owned this journalism palace, basically, and he was also part of the Round Table Group. Now, on the top shelf here, I have the papers of the Round Table, I have the papers of Lord Grey, and I have the papers of Colonel House, which goes well into the Doherty Macgregor World War One kind of conspiracy, how America was brought into the war to artificially extend the war and then get us into a military kind of state, which is also part of Rhodes's last will and testament. So when Rhodes dies in 1902, he has a bunch of young acolytes, students around him that want to see this thing too. So he has Lord Milner is his second, in command, and Milner has all these young guys around. They call it Milner's kindergarten. So this British intelligentsia that's going to go about bringing America back into the empire is kind of the Rhodes plan. So all of this is going on, and Quigley writes about this in 1966, but he first hears about this plan in 1948 from a whistleblower who was in the British Round Table Group, this group that was using Cecil Rhodes's last will and testament as a plan to take over the world. So Quigley, he's he worked at Princeton, he worked at DOD, he worked like at Harvard. He's a very academic. Okay, he's very Eastern establishment. He lived in Georgetown. He was friendly with Chip Bolin and a whole bunch of other people that were around the Kennedy situation. And in 48, when Quigley hears this story, he doesn't believe it, but he writes it down. And he writes it down as a book called The Anglo-American Establishment, which he did not allow to be published during his lifetime. So it becomes published in 1981 posthumously, and it gives you the dense details on the who, what, where, when, why, and how of this whole America being taken over by the British Empire and being used as a prophylactic to take over the world with, right? So Quigley hears this story. He doesn't believe it, but he writes it down. But then he spends the next 18 years in the Council on Foreign Relations archives writing Tragedy and Hope, the 1,300-page book. Now, the 1,300-page book in there has really like 10 key pages that tell you how the world works. And as soon as Quigley publishes this book in 1966, the powers that be that he's talking about say, get that off the market. So they take it off the market. They break the printing plates of the book so it can never be reprinted again. They then print the second half of the book verbatim because you don't know the first half of the story, but they'll let you see the second half of the story. That is published in 1968 as The World Since 1939, A History by Carroll Quigley. But it is not a real book. It is just what's left after they censored the first half of Tragedy and Hope. So now you're left with the situation that I hear Monteith make all these claims that there's this book and it tells a story and these things are true. And Rothschild was on like page 52. I was like, I had 5 years of college. I worked in New York City. I made a lot of money. I worked on Wall Street. If these things were going on, I would know about them, Chris. If there was a Rothschild family that has international banking dynasty power over, I would know. They would have told, Wall Street Journal would have told me, bro. Forbes would have told me. Come on, man. So I was so incredulous. And Tragedy and Hope was a very obscure book at that time. So I spent $300 to be like, nah. And then I read into it and I was like, oh shit. So I better start getting on my horse and learning here because obviously the way the world works is not what was taught to me through school or university or mainstream media. And I had good reasons to ask these questions and find answers. So in digging into Tragedy and Hope, first for the audience's benefit, let's help the audience. Tragedy and Hope 101 by Joseph Plummer is the Cliff Notes to the big 1,300-page book and the Anglo-American Establishment. He'll give you a free audio book version. You can go to joeplummer.com. He's a friend of mine. Like it's a tight summary that's going to save you a lot of time. And he's not doing it for the money. He's doing it to get this word out because no one's going to read 1,300 pages very quickly. So now so that answers the question of where did I hear about Tragedy and Hope? But once I realized what it was and that it was like a Rosetta Stone. Once you get this layer and see what's going on, we have an ally that speaks the same language as we do, But really, in the past, they were not our ally, and we had good reasons to separate. They still have a king over there, by the way. So there's been an Anglo-American influence in American politics since, 1902 with the Pilgrim Society and the CFR and other entities they created to kind of influence our politics and economics in this country. But there's also a globalist element to that where they're just using America's military as the property managers for what used to be British Empire. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. The British had a first, second, and third Anglo-Afghan wars. That means England was in Afghanistan for the opium for like 100 years, and then they hand off that to the Americans who, we pay those tax dollars to have all those bases around the world now. We did not start out as an empire. American ideals are not into international, affairs and getting into other people's business. This was the white man's burden of Rudyard Kipling in 1898, the Spanish-American War, where our British cousins were like, "Come on out, let's take over the world together. Come on." And this was part of the, what became codified as the Cecil Rhodes Plan to bring America back into the empire. The empire changed its name to a Commonwealth in the 1930s-ish, 20s, 30s. And Zimmern, who was the whistleblower, I believe, for Quigley, he wrote, the Third British Empire, those speeches at Columbia where he's like, this is how we got to get it done. So there's a lot of great history to this. And John, I'm excited, if I understand correctly, that you're the co-author on the new continuing of this unfolding of the story. I have all the books. We've talked about it. Yeah. So this is wonderful.
Yeah. Just I want to add just a few things here. Richard is supposed to be dead. Okay. He had a car that didn't facilitate him dying on 9/11 because he was supposed to be in that office.
I was in a 9/11. I was in a 9/11 convertible at the Ground Zero events that day.
Really?
And when I saw the second tower blow up, I panicked and I got out of there because I knew I was seeing something that wasn't an accident, and it scared. It was probably one of the most fearful times of my life, being exposed to something. I never thought I'd see anything like that there, and it was quite surprising, and that started to get my interest, but I didn't have answers.
Yeah.
All I had from that day was a bunch of questions, like how do you make 220 square acres of rebar reinforced concrete turn to dust in like 20 seconds total? I don't know how to do that. I don't know how the physics on that works.
Yeah.
So yeah,
that's another podcast.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
Marsha McLennan, AIG, that's a whole nother podcast.
Right.
Associates.
Now Stan Monteith, Dr. Monteith, I knew him very, very well. Oh, okay. He was a wonderful man. And I got to listen to, Alexandra Robbins. She came out with her book about Skull and Bones. They're trying to preempt Sutton, and she wouldn't tell which secret society she was a member of. But Stan had her on, and Stan just told her, says, "Oh, well, you're a member of Scroll and Key."
Yes.
And she said, "Huh?" And he said, "Yeah, because Stan was also a good friend of Professor Sutton's." Okay, and John and Jim have put together Quigley, Sutton, and the gentleman from Italy, Preparata.
Guido Preparata.
Right. They put all that information together. Okay, and it really is a tour de force. So, John, what led you to Jim and being the co-author of this incredible book?
Well, this did.
Yeah.
The Anglo-American establishment. I came across it in Glasgow University Library when I was just browsing, and it blew me away. But I've met Jim as a result of that free fall event that Richard's just described. I do understand the physics of free fall, and that's what I saw on 9/11. Towers which were free falling, and they had free falling because they were demolished from the inside. And so when we went to war against Iraq, after allegedly a bunch of Saudi folks flew planes into the Twin Towers, I knew there was something.
They were remote controlled.
I knew there was something a bit fishy about the whole thing. So I started writing letters to the Glasgow Herald saying that Blair was taking us into war on false pretenses. And a guy called Dr. Jim Macgregor was writing similar letters to the Herald, because Jim had been doing his homework for many years as well. And I'd been reading Chomsky for years, and I came across Quigley in the University Library at Glasgow University, just sitting on a shelf. And I was very interested in that, because I was very interested in how this little part of the world is run by the English upper classes, which takes us to Ruskin, of course, and we'll go on to that. But anyway, that's how I got together with Jim, because we knew that the war was a lie. We knew that the invasion of Iraq was on false pretenses, a pretext, and we kind of thought we knew what the reason was. It kind of was to do with stuff that we'd both been looking at about the background to the takeover of Eurasia and the need for control of the Central Asian landmass, and the war that had been going on for about 150 years, including the Great Game for Afghanistan and various things like that. So we knew what was going on there, because we understood how the British ruling class worked. If the British ruling class tells you something, if a posh British lord tells you something, you know he's lying because his lips are moving. And we understood that. We understood it very well indeed. And so Jim got together. I was still working at the time. I was still digging into earning my crust at universities. And Jim got together with Jerry Docherty, who he met at his son's graduation from Glasgow University. And Jerry had been a head teacher in a school and had an interest in history, although he was a trained economist. And they got together and put together Jim's first book, because the second publication was an extension of that. The one that you did, Kris, the Trine Day one, Prolonging the Agony, was in fact part of the original book, but it was too big to publish in one gasp. And as you say, his mainstream publisher took fright after the publication of the first one. No doubt his ear had been whispered into by the powers that be, saying you can't publish this kind of stuff. We're not supposed to know this stuff.
I just want to show you, because you're talking about Prolonging the Agony.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I bought 2 copies of this, and I didn't even know that Kris published it.
Right.
I just wanted the book. So as you guys are talking about it, I'm for the first time realizing this is a Trine Day book. I have many Trine Day books, but I was so interested in getting this one that I just put it in my Amazon cart without even noticing who published it, Kris. That's how good you are, bro. You're just putting stuff in the market, you know. And as far as Guido Preparata,
yeah,
he wrote the afterword to Sean's book,
New World Order, A Strategy of Imperialism.
And I wrote the foreword to it. So I know him via working on this project,
right,
which is like the sequel to Anglo-American Establishment.
Right.
But he also wrote
Conjuring Hitler, How Britain and America Made the Third Reich and Destroyed Europe.
Which is
very
important. So I come into this as a result of my skepticism about mainstream academia, because I had kind of got interested in economics later in my life, and I had trained as a scientist. I did a PhD in molecular pathology of cancer, and then I started studying economics, and it just felt wrong. It felt completely wrong, because the way you do science is that you make empirical observations, you form a theory, and you test the theory. But economics didn't seem to work like that. What they had in economics was a whole load of axioms that somebody had sat down and written on a piece of paper, which bore no relationship to how markets work or how the economy works. But these axioms proved very useful. And although economics started out as political economy, where it was linked to where economics studies were linked to power relations and social relations, that was stripped out of it, and you get something called economics, which is basically physics envy, a whole load of mathematics, which describes nothing except the paper exercises on the back of the jotters of the economists, and they come up with something which they call a science, which bears no relationships to science. And so I get kind of interested in that through economics and the powerful, convenient theories, distorted facts, and ample rewards. This is a very interesting and useful book. Before that, I had read Debunking Economics by Steve Keen, and I've read everything by this chap here, The Bubble and Beyond, Michael Hudson, right?
Yeah.
So if you really want to understand economics, you read these things, right? Because basically what economics in universities is, and therefore economics in Wall Street and economics in the business world, is a whole load of mythology which is presented as science, and everybody is taught it at universities, and they all go into politics and they believe this stuff. And its purpose is actually to make money go from the bottom to the top in one direction, and that's what it's done. And that's one of the reasons why we're in the mess that we're in.
If I understand what you're saying correctly, you're saying they have a bunch of axioms because you're a scientist, right? And you're looking at economics, and you're noticing they make a bunch of axioms, but those axioms don't have a connection back to reality.
No.
And normally science would start with reality, and then you draw axioms from it. And so this absence of connections to axioms means it's all made up, right? Like when reality is not connected to the axioms,
right,
it's all made up. And so
the axioms are internally consistent. You know, they work very well as mathematics.
Of course. Can I give you a metaphor? Because I was just trying to translate for the audience. So it's the same thing they did with World Trade Center 7. They made a mathematical model of how it fell without ever going to the evidence to start with.
Yeah.
That's what NIST did. Because I interviewed a scientist from NIST who admitted it's like they never used the data from the actual event. Yeah. They just made up how could it fall. And that's the same thing you're saying with economics. It doesn't start with free market capitalism. It starts with slavery and black markets, and then has Adam Smith and other East India Company people come and put a shine and polish on the slavery.
Yes, it's a polished turd, as we say here, and it's taught as if it was reality in universities. And most of the British cabinet, for instance, did politics, philosophy, and economics (PPE) at Oxford University. Oxford University figures strongly in our book, because Oxford University is the means by which the British powers that be control what's taught in schools, what politicians know, what our newspapers know, all of that. And as it is for economics, so it is for history. And that's what Jim Macgregor introduced me to. Well, both of us had read Quigley, and we realized that something similar was going on with history. That's why Jim asked me to come in on the book, because I was very interested in what was happening in the paradigms that lie behind these subjects. A good primer to that is Quigley, of course, because Quigley tells you that the gold standard for historical research is documents. So you look for the documents and you find they aren't there. Because what happens to the documents? Well, the documents are actually records of a crime scene in the case of the British Empire, and so they destroy them. So there are no documents. You look for documents and there are none. But then they teach in history courses at Oxford University, which set the standard for history teaching in Britain, and I guess with Harvard in the US they do the same. And they say that unless you've got original sources, you don't have history. So you can't understand what's happened and why people are doing the things that they're doing, because they've destroyed the evidence. Because the documents that would form the history, if you were doing it properly, are actually evidence from a crime scene.
Let me identify two of the crimes here. One of them is the control of Central Asia. Okay, and the British were looking at that in geopolitics.
Yeah, that's
and they didn't want Germany and Russia to come together, because they felt if Germany and Russia came together, they would control the heartland.
Exactly.
They would control the world. Okay.
This is the great game, and those were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria too.
Yeah. Right. And they all come out of Saxe-Gotha, where the guy from the Illuminati, that's where he went to go hide after he got kicked out of Bavaria. So, they basically prepare for this war. It should have been over just really quick. They send the food to Germany so that the soldiers have the calorie intake to continue fighting the war and all of this.
They financed both sides and they fed both sides.
Right. And you got Hoover involved in all of this, the Belgian Relief Committee and all of that. And then the other crime, okay, is about our money. Thomas Jefferson, Lord have mercy, our nation should be producing our money. Okay. We shouldn't be getting it from some private bankers. Okay.
Yeah, but when Abraham Lincoln tried that with greenbacks, they had him killed.
Yeah, well, so did Kennedy. But so in working with Jim on this book, what was the most outrageous thing that you came across that really drove you nuts about history that you didn't know?
Well, the fact that Hitler had been recruited by the security services of the United States and Britain, and had actually been talent spotted in there because they were looking for someone who would start this war with Russia on their behalf. Well, Versailles was another crime, but Hitler, that grew in lots of Hitlers around Germany because they starved Germany after the war by loading them up with impossible debts at Versailles. And they fulfilled these debts by printing money and by the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. And what happened was that Germany's gold ended up in Wall Street, and America's paper ended up building up the armaments for Germany. But they actually recruited Hitler himself. There was an American agent called Putzi Hanfstaengl, who was half American, half German, but from his Sedgwick mother's side, he was a Boston Brahmin. They dropped him into Germany during the point at which their currency was dying and they were living in poverty. And he went over there with his new wife and a young son and made friends with Hitler.
His piano player.
The piano player. But in fact, Jim has produced very convincing evidence that, in fact, he was being run from the American embassy by Truman Smith, who was an American agent. First of all, he picked up in Hitler in 1923, I think, and he taught him a whole load of useful talents, like public speaking and how to behave in polite society. And he created this guy, and he helped him in the beer hall push in 1933. He was actually there. He gave him shelter afterward when the police were looking for him. And then he was recruited by Hitler as Hitler built up his party, the Nazi party. And he was Hitler's speechwriter and communications commissar, and he did all sorts for Hitler. He befriended him. He was a godfather. Hitler was a kind of godfather to their son. And they paid him. You see. And the money came through various means, but eventually through BIS, the Bank for International Settlements at Basel. And it was US money that was funding the party. It was funding the propaganda paper. It was funding the brown shirts. It was funding a lot, and it funded the rearmament of Germany. And they did this through the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, which is actually Wall Street. Well, it wasn't just Wall Street, it was JP Morgan. And all this money was used to build Hitler. And because what they needed Hitler to do was to go to war with Russia.
And so we have this big psychodrama, that affects history down the road,
No, it affects it to this day. We're still playing that game right now in Iraq.
Yeah.
It's a little worse, actually. I'm going to fortify everything you just said. Do you guys know how Mein Kampf came into the English language? Arthur Balfour of the Balfour Declaration,
right.
his niece, Blanche Balfour Dugdale, and her husband, Edgar Dugdale, bring Mein Kampf into English, which is interesting because the Balfour Declaration is also still going on today, right? So these
Yep.
wars that we have today do have lineage back to these types of times. And I would say not only did they fund and kind of train him, but they did PR for him because otherwise nobody would have known about Mein Kampf if
Sure.
they didn't bring it into English.
Sure.
I've never read it, but I do know it doesn't have Rothschilds in the book, which is also a fascinating element that he wasn't very specific in the, in his claims of financial oppression. But I also wanted to touch on the BIS because you just mentioned the Bank for International Settlements and its role in Adolf Hitler's coming to power. And when you have a guy from Brooklyn, Helmar Horace Greeley Shack,
Yeah.
who's Hitler's
Yep.
banker,
Yep.
right? He's
Yep.
also working with Montague Norman
Norman. Yeah.
of
It's all
Bank
in
of
our.
England, and that's like page 50 of Tragedy and Hope. That's what
Well,
Quigley's
we have it
telling
in
you.
our book.
Yeah.
All of this.
And then the last one was the Boston Brahmins. A lot of people don't know about the first families of Boston and these very powerful element of like Ben Bradley, who ran Washington Post. He's a
Yeah.
Boston Brahmin. He comes from the Crown and Shield family, and that's a very powerful Eastern establishment family. These are the types of families that can take a president off the stage from an assassination in 1963 and continue to cover it up to this day because they work with the British Cliveden set type of establishment. And this is again what Quigley was blowing the whistle on in a way that he was trying to do and still stay alive. But
Right. And it was earlier than 1900s. I mean, Belmont came over 1830.
oh, of course, he
Okay.
was the
And
official Rothschild agent in America,
Yeah.
and he ran the Democratic National Committee during the Civil War.
right, right, right. You
That's a
know,
long history that also involves Pilgrim Society and
Exactly.
thoroughbred racing and a whole bunch of other aspects, but it
right.
does tie back to a certain international banking dynasty for
So,
sure.
so what are we going to do with all this knowledge of history?
Well, that's a good question. And for the past 20 years, I was like, this is going on, but people don't know about it. So what can I do about it? I can make myself familiar with the primary sources and people who talk about all these primary sources, right? To learn about new primary sources. So I've made it my job for the past 20 years to collect the first edition of all the quotes and all the books of they, them, those who can easily be named, who said it in their own words. Like I not only have the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes, I have William T. Stead's personal copy of the book. He's the author of the book. This I got from the guy who bought the Review of Reviews library. So I wanted the best. I have Woodrow Wilson in 1911 because there's a quote that's attributed to him, and I was again incredulous. Is this a real quote or not? And what I found out is it's not a real quote because what he says takes 8 pages. And so then, therefore, they have to paraphrase this kind of, but he says there exists a small group of people that when somebody honest tries to enter a market, this group will act as a monopoly to keep them out.
Yeah.
And so there's an invisible hand in our market that has nothing to do with constitutional republicanism.
Well, you don't have a republic anymore. You have a security state. The republic is gone.
Security oligarchy.
Yeah, these people who took over, these people who were originally from the UK and then the banks got involved. These people stole the state, stole the republic from you, and are using the republic as a to project force where they need it to be protected for their business interests. Nothing else. Nothing else. You don't
Same
have
way that NATO uses Ukraine as a prophylactic to fuck with Russia.
Sure. And we've never had a democracy in the UK. We've got a king, as you said. We've got an unelected head of state. The last 3 prime ministers were unelected. Stammer was elected, but only by 32% of the vote because we have a crazy electoral system. We don't have a democracy in this country. We have 2 houses of parliament. We have the House of Commons, which is elected by a very flawed electoral system, and we have the House of Lords, which is entirely either hereditary or appointed.
Yeah.
And we have feudalism. We still have feudalism.
Would you guys like a constitutional republic? Because we're going to restore our republic. We might as well hook you guys up. I think that's what we didn't do last time. We didn't come across and help our cousins.
Well,
and we should have done that like in 1815.
Both Jim Macgregor and I are very, very strongly for an independent Scotland because for the sake of Scotland, we would like an independent Republic of Scotland. But we would also that would give Scotland a bit of its liberty back, but also it would mean the end of the British state, and the British state has poisoned the world through its empire, through the English empire. We like to think of it as an English empire. Britain is an invented word, which is cover
Yes.
for English hegemony.
It means people of the covenant to be British.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it
There
goes
is no
back
such,
to
there is no such thing as Great Britain is an island. It's a geographical entity. There is no such thing as the British people. There are Scots, English, Irish, and Welsh. And the
That's what I'm
Scots,
saying.
the majority of Scots want independence.
I thought the word British came into parlance like in 1832, which is coincidentally the same year they privatized the opium trade.
Well,
1832, right? So I thought the word came in as it meant people of the covenant, and that it came from Hebrew, which is also why there's Hebrew in the Yale logo, which is
Well-
the East India Company University College here in America.
It comes from the name of the first people that are recognized to have lived in this island, the Britons, which were an ancient tribe, various ancient tribes. Their
Okay.
descendants are still in Wales. They speak a Brittonic language called Welsh.
Well,
And
I could keep this conversation going on forever.
Could I throw in a quick couple questions?
Sure.
Thank you, Kris. John, those two books you referenced, were you saying they would teach economics accurately? I think one was called Economics on the Powerful, and the other was The Bubble and Beyond. One should read those in order to.
Those are two of many books which would give you an insight into how Wall Street works and how the City of London works.
Can I
Because
just
we're
add to
wrapping
that,
up.
since you guys are talking economics books, The Lost Science of Money by Stephen Zarlinga, who also published Quigley's Evolution of Civilizations, I think he did.
Yeah.
So this is a 600-page case study on how money has been defined through human history. Yep, one of the fundamental pieces.
Thank
Sure.
you, John. Another quickie for you. You mentioned someone named Hamstein as the U.S. agent befriending Hitler. What was his first name?
No, it was
Fuzzy Havenstagel. Yeah,
Ernst.
he wrote a book called Hitler, the Missing Years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, he didn't actually write it. It was written by a member of the British security on his behalf.
Yeah. Yeah. And another
It's
book,
one of the clues.
Double Government and National Security, is a very good book.
Yeah, I
National
just
security.
read that. Yeah. That's all for now, gentlemen. Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome.
Any last words, John?
I'm very excited about this book being published. I think it takes Jim's original story from the First World War right up until the beginning of World War II. And I'm extremely excited because the same people who we identify in this book, other descendants, are still doing the same things today. And we still have the same problems, the same methods, the same ideas, the same aim to control the heartland of Eurasia. And it's very timely that we're publishing this just now.
Caused the death of a lot of people. Richard, any last thoughts?
I know that reading is the answer, but not a lot of people want to read. So the way I get myself and my audience to do some reading is we start with a good documentary. In this case, I would recommend World War I Conspiracy by James Corbett. It's based on the all the content we talked about here today.
Yeah.
The video is on YouTube on the channel Corbett Report Extras, dated 3 years ago, so about 2021.
I know of
So-
James Corbett's work, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm in that film, and we use the primary sources from the private papers of the people who started World War I and got America into it. And I'm also working on a World War II project. I don't know what his official title is, but Corbett has a second edition to show the continuity of how this internationalist, globalist force that does have a stronghold out of Oxford has gotten the world into a second world war in the 1930s and 40s. So that's the forensic history. And if you are looking to learn more, I do a weekly show to cover the news and analyze it in a lens of history, grandtheftworld.com. It's Sunday nights, and it goes on from 9 p.m. till 4 a.m. Eastern. Thanks, Kris, for introducing me to John today.
Well, thank you both very much. I mean, you could have been doing something else today. You spent some time with us.
Could I indulge an extra 60 seconds?
Sure.
Please, thank you to Richard. 60 seconds. That's the challenge, my friend. What is the status of restoring the republic here in America?
Well, I think that once people know there's a problem, like for the past 20 years, it was really difficult to just get a small percentage of people to look into this problem. But thankfully, since the World Economic Forum and their friends saw fit to bring COVID to the world, people woke up. And it's kind of a one-way valve, right? We are the low pressure area of truth. They're coming out of a high pressure area of lies and deception. Once they find the narrative that more closely represents reality, they're there for good for the rest of their lives. That's the red pilling process, if you will. So it doesn't have to take a long time, but it's been like a hockey stick or an exponential curve that's developed. So we're growing in mass today of people who appreciate freedom and understand its relationship to the free market and our ability to be entrepreneurs and make our lives without plundering the production of others. If we want to see peace in the world, we have to figure out, how to do trade and barter and business with each other without using authority or monopoly of force or violence to make those transactions happen. So, learning's the answer. What's the question? I help people with it in a variety of ways, from entrepreneurism through understanding what's going on in the world and weekly news.
Best place for people to find you and your work?
GrandTheftWorld.com and GetAutonomy.info is my entrepreneur training and free market training for people who want to learn how to make their offer to the market and be able to make more money than they need.
Thank you.
Onwards to a better future for our children.
It's Whitney Houston who said, I believe the children are our future. That's one of the few things I think she got right. We need to take care of them and educate them. And education is done by free will, free association, and asking questions and finding answers. That has nothing to do with schooling. So we have to rediscover that freedom for ourselves. And that's where the rest of the dominoes start falling.
Everybody brings something to the table. And isn't it nice that at least we have a table?
It's great to have friends at the table, too.
Yep. Yep. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.